Hey everyone, it's Last Protagonist. I want to talk to you today about the passive skill tree in Path of Exile 2, but before getting into it, I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about the current state of the skill tree and classes in general. Are you currently happy with what we've got? Do you think it meshes well with your class or ascendancy? Do you feel limited by options, and if so, what class are you, and what do you think could be done to improve your experience? With that out of the way, first I'd like to play a clip from an interview with game director Jonathan Rogers talking about the intended state of class identity heading into Path of Exile 2's early access launch.
Where's my necromancer? Like, is the third ascendancy gonna be like occult chaos, dot, curse, and minions, or what are we expecting to see here?
I won't say exactly what it is, but what I will say is this. One challenge we have with the ascendancies is we don't want it to be that if you're playing a minion character, here's the one ascendancy, right? Like, we don't want it to be that this is always your choice. So this makes it very tricky to design because we need to make sure that there's like something and a variety of these that you'd actually be interested in. And so that being said, look, I think it's a cool fantasy that we want to have the sort of necromancer type thing, but I think that in order to do it, we have to make it so it's not just so obviously what you need to pick that's the only choice. And effectively, so this is the design problem we have.
First off, I want to say I respect the decision to try and not have players feel forced into playing specific archetypes for certain builds, but I don't think that idea works with the current version of the passive skill tree. If, for example, I wanted to use minions as a Gemling Legionnaire, I'd be severely limiting the power of my build simply because there aren't enough minion nodes on the southern half of the skill tree to make them viable in the endgame. Sure, I could try to level them up and use them during the campaign, but I need to level up 22 times just to get 55% increased minion damage when I can get the equivalent of that in projectile damage by level 5. Now, maybe not every class should be capable of using minions. That's fine. The issue is, if the rationale for not including certain ascendancies like necromancers because the devs didn't want people to feel forced to pick that while playing minions, they've kind of still got that going on by the virtue of what's actually on the passive skill tree. If you wanted to use crossbows and grenades on any other class than the mercenary, well, you're out of luck finding nodes that buff grenades or reduce your reload times, effectively making it so that if you want to use a crossbow, you either have to be a mercenary to begin with, or go out of your way to path toward it if you're a ranger. And if you're not a mercenary or a ranger, I hope you enjoy traveling. This poses a lot of problems for players and developers alike. For players, builds quickly become homogenized as they find tried and true pathings to get as much power to the skill tree as possible. For developers, relaxing class restrictions too much can end up making classes feel meaningless. On the flip side, if class archetypes are enforced too strongly, then player agency and build diversity suffers, so it's a really fine line to walk in getting things feeling right. However, if it's truly intended for players to be allowed to use any kind of weapon or skill, then I'd prefer it if we had more redundancy baked into the passive skill tree. So for example, the grenade nodes I mentioned earlier. It'd be nice if other classes had access to these kinds of nodes as well, but I admit, it might make the tree more cluttered than it already is. One of the things I like a lot about the current passive skill tree is that attributes can be allocated to give either strength, dexterity, or intelligence. This offers a lot of flexibility in where I can path throughout the skill tree, and makes it much easier to adjust my build as I get new pieces of equipment. Because of how convenient this is, it makes me wish we had a similar option for elemental nodes as well. So rather than needing to path specifically toward fire, cold, or lightning nodes, it'd be nice if we could choose between them, and I wouldn't mind having chaos damage be an option as well. Part of the reason I bring this up is because your options can be pretty limited speccing into certain kinds of elemental damage depending on your starting position on the skill tree. Monks, for example, have pretty ready access to things like lightning and cold nodes, but very little in the way of fire ones unless they start pathing to the sorcerer side of the skill tree. Warriors barely have access to elemental damage modifiers at all, which is pretty ironic since the avatar of fire node is on that side of the tree as well, so I hope you like physical damage if you're gonna go warrior. Now, again, these wouldn't be so problematic if the intended goal of the class design was to have specific builds for specific archetypes, but if we're supposed to be free to pick and choose what we want, it can feel pretty disappointing and disheartening to know how severely you'll be limiting yourself, especially in the endgame, if you deviate from the meta picks of your given class archetype. We can chalk some of this up to things still being imbalanced because it's early access, and we only have half the classes and 1/3 of the total ascendancies available right now, but I think it's important we give this kind of feedback as early and as loudly as possible because it feels like the cart is being placed a little bit before the horse when it comes to class design right now. Why do I say that? Because when we look at the lack of fire nodes on the monk side of the skill tree, it perfectly aligns with how there are currently no fire-based skills available for quarterstaves. Does that really mean monks should get virtually no access to fire damage as a class? Of course, while I still think we can get a lot of value from having individual nodes affect a single element on the skill tree, one advantage of being able to choose between multiple options would be that it could help consolidate different sections of the skill tree while arguably giving players more agency in their choices. However, something else Jonathan's mentioned is that in the past, when they tried to give players nodes which increased multiple stats like minion damage and spell damage, the players who were only interested in upping their spell damage would try to avoid the dual damage nodes because they weren't interested in minions even if they'd effectively be receiving the same power increases. Maybe introducing player choice could help alleviate that problem, but I'm willing to admit there may be some nuances to the current design of the skill tree we're unaware of. Nonetheless, one of the current hurdles in talking about the passive skill tree comes from determining whether certain issues stem from the design of the tree itself versus the current balance of items, skills, or both. Even so, part of the reason some builds are able to take off as well as they do comes from the opportunity cost of investment. Warriors using maces, for instance, are heavily incentivized into allocating Giant's Blood, which allows them to use a two-handed weapon with only one hand, even if they're running totem builds, because two-handed weapons can get +7 skill levels on them, whereas one-handed maces can only get +5. Because Giant's Blood triples the attribute requirements of your weapons, it all but ensures that warriors will need to start strength stacking in order to use their equipment properly. Now, if you're going to be stacking strength as a warrior, then strength becomes a virtual necessity on equipment, and you'll need to path on the skill tree in such a way that your build will end up looking the same as all the other strength stacking warrior builds out there. To compound things further, if warriors take advantage of their two-handed mace by increasing the levels of their skills, then they run into the issue of vastly increased mana costs. And wouldn't you know it, the nodes on the passive tree which allow them to scale their strength higher also come with the drawback of reducing their maximum mana. This heavily incentivizes warriors to then take the blood magic node to transform their mana costs into life costs, so now they've got to adjust their builds into allowing them to recover the HP that they're spending on skills. Life Leech and Regeneration are conceptually okay, I guess, but I'd argue they feel especially bad in Path of Exile 2 when the vast majority of the danger you'll encounter comes in the form of being one-shot. So what utility do you really get out of pumping up your Leech and Regeneration if you're already at the risk of being hit for more than your maximum amount of HP? To add insult to injury, the only way you can even get Leech right now is primarily through the Life Leaf gem, which only allows you to leech back physical damage, and it's a support gem, meaning you can only have it apply to one skill at a time, and it had better be a physical one you're fine with not maximizing the damage of. Honestly, I don't know if this is a balance issue, and that one-handed maces should be buffed, or if Giant's Blood's attribute requirements should be lowered, or if this is all the result of a myriad of smaller problems meshing together. We could argue that if players were less likely to be one-shot in the endgame, that we'd have more flexibility in how we mitigate damage, and that could contribute to there being more build diversity, but to return to the original point I was making when I brought this up, the cost to invest in making a proper warrior build is extremely high, and I don't think the current iteration of the skill tree gives warriors as many tools to succeed as other classes. If you're interested in hearing more about this subject, I'd highly recommend checking out Shinshin's video titled Warriors Are Boring and It's a Big Problem, No Build Diversity, where he goes into way more detail than I do. The link is in the video description. One issue with the current iteration of the passive skill tree is how much more confined each class is to their starting area. Although it wasn't perfect and still had issues, one way Path of Exile 1 managed this problem was by having a kind of bridge that connected each section of the skill tree to the center, so players could feasibly travel from their starting position on one side of the tree into the complete opposite direction if they wanted to. This did take a sizable investment, but there were also a lot of pretty generic utility and defensive nodes in the middle section of the tree, and enough nodes clustered together that you could also make great use of some time-lost jewels that could really help offset a lot of these costs. Without this connective tissue in the middle of the skill tree, some classes are really out of luck if they want to try some unorthodox build options, and I think there are a number of ways this could be addressed. Of course, if the devs want to ensure that certain classes play by certain archetypes, that's fine, but that's not the impression I received from Jonathan's interview with Ghazzy DM. I could be wrong though, so maybe we could use some more clarification on the devs front in regard to their intent with the class design. But anyway, before I even started playing Path of Exile 2, a part of me was hoping we'd have something akin to waygates on the passive skill tree that would allow us to travel directly from one section of the tree to another, kind of like how it worked with the Atlas skill tree in Path of Exile 1. Ideally, the placement of waygates shouldn't matter that much, but one thing I've noticed about the skill tree is that a lot of the more interesting keystone nodes are currently located on the outer ring of the tree, which requires a lot of traveling to get to. Maybe it'd be nice to have a waygate located at the end of each class's section on the skill tree we could travel between. This would give players a lot more flexibility in continuing to iterate on their builds after establishing a bit of a core identity, and it may even allow some more impactful keystone nodes to be pushed back in toward the beginning or the center of the skill tree, so that way players are incentivized to travel back toward the center of the tree. I think GGG would be against it, and I don't even really know how I feel about it either, but another idea would be instead of having one massive skill tree, it might be worth considering having individual passive skill trees for each class that players could travel between instead. This might help bolster feelings of class identity while still allowing a high degree of player freedom, but maybe there should still be some restrictions that require some investment into one class before you could invest in another. But really, these are just starting points in a broader conversation, and if you guys have ideas you want to discuss or see implemented into the game, feel free to share them in the comment section. I'd be interested to read them. Although it'd be kind of a pain in the ass, I'd prefer it if GGG were more willing to make rapid, drastic changes during the early access period and throw whatever they could at the wall to see what sticks in terms of balance and class design. Moving beyond that, one of the bigger complaints I have about the passive tree for Path of Exile 2 is that it feels rather bland compared to Path of Exile 1, and a lot of the more impactful nodes come with significant drawbacks for no discernible reason, like strength stacking warriors losing max mana for who knows why. I'd almost prefer it if the drawbacks were removed entirely, and the rest of the nodes were nerfed to compensate, but I have a feeling if they were to do that, it exposed just how unimpactful the vast majority of nodes on the passive tree really are. I know how tempting it is to say, it's early access, and we've only got half the classes and 1/3 of the total ascendancies available, and we're still missing a ton of weapons and skills. But I don't think this should entirely excuse how untenable certain options are in the skill tree right now. For instance, if I wanted to leech back life as a mercenary with a crossbow, I've realistically got what? One skill in fragmentation rounds that scales purely with physical damage, yet over 20 life leech nodes in that section of the tree? Maybe all the life leech nodes would be okay if there were more ways to interact with them, but this ain't it with things as they are now. Maybe someone will say I'm cherry picking my data points with life leech, but it's really meant to be an arbitrary example, and I feel like I could just as easily ask if it feels good to level or scale with chaos damage right now, and see what people have to say. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of defensive layers, but what I will say is that classes which have access to ways to solve multiple problems by building into one stat or resource can vastly outscale other classes that can't, by the virtue of needing to invest so much less into their builds, but I don't know of a good way to address this issue. One example of this is you can combine the Everlasting Gaze Amulet with passive nodes like Eldritch Battery and Mind Over Matter, so that way your energy shield gets converted into mana, which takes damage before life. So if you were to use a skill gem like Archmage, which converts your maximum mana into extra damage, you essentially solve the problems of trying to figure out how to deal damage and increase your effective pool of HP at the same time. In addition to that, because of the way mana essentially becomes your life, it allows players to safely allocate Chaos Inoculation, which makes them immune to chaos damage at the cost of reducing their max HP to 1 life. This frees players from needing to roll life and chaos resistances on all of their gear, and it also trivializes content which deals chaos damage to the player, like certain on-death explosions and ritual and strongbox encounters. In other words, the benefits from stacking a mana and energy shield are that you get increased life, increased damage, the ability to ignore lethal game mechanics, and more flexible, cheaper options gearing your character, whereas other characters have to invest more into their builds dealing with these problems individually. Personally, I think this is a rather elegant solution to a number of problems, and a part of me really likes this and thinks it should stay in the game because first of all, it's cool, and takes a significant investment and attention to detail to pull it off. However, the vast majority of other builds can't reach the same heights as a mana stacking Archmage build simply because they don't have the tools to compete. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that I want every build to devolve into stat stacking shenanigans with Hand of Wisdom in action and Astramentus. I'd rather that other options were buffed to be able to compete with these kinds of builds instead. However, Part of the reason Archmage and Hoa builds can take off the way they do is because they can scale better than other builds, and buffing undertuned options might just mean we end up with a different flavor of Archmage or Hoa build instead. It's entirely possible the way this all gets solved, if such a thing is possible, is from nerfing the outliers like Archmage, Cast on X, and Hoa, as well as the damage on monsters to reduce one-shots and dramatically slow down the pace of the endgame. For what it's worth, I do think life and armor-based builds need some kind of buff, so it'll be interesting to see if the devs backpedal on whether or not life or resistance node should be included into the passive tree, but if they do that, I worry how much more thinly our skill points will be spread out on builds that are already spread thin. A big part of me wonders how much of a player's power should be determined from their passive tree versus their gear, and with Path of Exile centered on being a loot treadmill, it's no surprise that the vast majority of a player's power will come from their items. I don't know about you, but with the current state of the RNG, I'd prefer it if a little of that power were brought back into the passive tree, or for it to just have a little more impact when leveling up. Like I said before, there's a lot of moving parts to consider, and some of the issues with the design of the passive tree could ultimately stem from other parts of the game. So if you guys think I'm right about the current state of the tree being underwhelming, let me know, or if you think I'm wrong and out of touch, what do you think should be addressed instead? If you enjoyed the video, let me know with a like, comment, or a sub, and special shout out to all my patrons and channel members for their continued support and providing me the motivation to continue working on videos like this one. I'd also like to thank you for watching to the end, and if you guys are interested in learning more about Archmage and Hoa builds, you can watch literally any other Path of Exile 2 video than this one. Before I go, I want to reiterate my hatred for accuracy as a stat because I somehow avoided it up to this point, and I'd rather see it removed. Anyway, that'll be it for me for now, so hopefully I'll catch you on the next one. Until then, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.